This is Radio Health Journal. I'm Reed Pence. This week, another pandemic on the horizon, Parkinson's disease.
Parkinson's was a very rare condition when it was first described in 1817 and now is the world's fastest growing condition.
What could be called a man-made disease when Radio Health Journal returns.
I'm Nancy Benson, host of Radio Health Journal. If you enjoy listening to Radio Health Journal, you'll also like our sister show, Viewpoints, which covers a wide array of topics from education to history to the environment. Here's a preview of what they're covering this week on Viewpoints.
A group of whites ended up dragging him to death behind an automobile right in downtown Tulsa.
The horrific tragedies of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. Then,
there's so much in the world that we couldn't see in any other way except using statistics.
The pros and cons of living in the era of endless information. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth this week on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
Listen to Viewpoints on your favorite radio station and subscribe and listen to shows anytime on Apple Podcasts and Google Play.
COVID-19 has disrupted our lives for nearly a year now, so the last thing we want to hear about is yet another pandemic. However, some experts say that's exactly what's on the horizon. They're not talking about another virus, but rather a neurological disorder that's rapidly increasing in virtually every region of the world, Parkinson's disease.
Parkinson's was a very rare condition when it was first described in 1817 and now is the world's fastest growing condition. No one that we know of is immune to the condition. It's rising in virtually every parts of the world, including the United States, Canada, China, India, and even sub-Saharan Africa, where before it was exceedingly rare. It's a very debilitating disease. It causes, the classic tremor and shuffling gait, but it causes depression and anxiety, dementia, and constipation.
That's Dr. Ray Dorsey, professor of neurology at the University of Rochester Medical Center and co-author of the book Ending Parkinson's Disease, A Prescription for Action. He says that neurological diseases like Parkinson's are the leading cause of disability in the world.
Alzheimer's disease affects 5.5 million Americans. Parkinson's is even growing faster than Alzheimer's disease. A recent study by the Michael J. Fox Foundation and colleagues found that the economic burden of Parkinson's is $50 billion. $50,000 per individual with a Parkinson's disease. Half of that is in healthcare costs, chiefly borne by Medicare, and half of that's in so-called indirect healthcare expenditures, lost productivity, lost wages, increased caregiver demands. If we don't address and prevent these diseases, not only are we going to bear a huge economic burden, we're going to bear a huge health burden. And that health burden is not only borne by the people with the disease, that health burden is borne by their caregivers, their friends, and their family members.
But why this sudden rise in Parkinson's? It's not genetics. Research shows that genetic factors account for only 10 to 15% of all Parkinson's cases worldwide. But more of a contributor, Dorsey says, are chemicals found in pesticides and pollution. Cases have been on the rise since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, and it's been on our radar for 60 years.
Rachel Carson, as you know, wrote the book Silent Spring in 1962, and this book launched the environmental movement, including the formation of the EPA under President Richard Nixon in 1972, I believe. And she wrote in her book in 1962, "The farmers spoke of much illness among their families. In the town, the doctors had become more and more puzzled by new kinds of sickness appearing among their patients." And she had no idea that one of those new kinds of sickness would be Parkinson's disease, but numerous studies have demonstrated that farmers and people who live in rural areas are anywhere from 50 to 150% more likely to develop Parkinson's disease.
Many pesticides are neurotoxins that target brain cells. Dorsey says one of the worst pesticides still used in the United States is called Paraquat.
It was developed in the 1950s. It's considered the most toxic herbicide ever created. It kills the weeds that Roundup can't. 32 countries, including China, have banned the pesticide, but the United States has not. In fact, in October of this past year, just 3 months ago, the EPA reapproved the use of Paraquat, even though 32 other countries have banned it. The use of this pesticide has doubled over the last decade, tripled over the last 25 years, and increased about 20 or 30% in the last year, according to the U.S. Geological Service. And it covers most of the heartland and most of the eastern United States, as well as parts of California.
Today, more than 1 million Americans have Parkinson's disease. Pesticide exposure is one reason why 10% of them are veterans.
Veterans are at high risk for at least 3 reasons. The first is that many were exposed to pesticides like Agent Orange during the Vietnam War. Agent Orange is a toxic pesticide, and it's been linked to Parkinson's disease. The second is that many people in the military were exposed to an industrial chemical called trichloroethylene, or TCE. TCE is a fantastic degreasing agent. It removes grease from all automobile parts, tanks, jet engines, and the like, and many people working in the military have been exposed to that chemical.
The third reason is that members of the military are at risk for traumatic brain injury. But if this sounds like only farmers and veterans are at a high risk for Parkinson's, don't be fooled. Dorsey says all of us may be at risk.
I'll give you a concrete example of what can happen. In Hawaii, they one time sprayed a pesticide on the feed that they gave to cows, and many of these pesticides are fat-soluble, so they dissolve in the cow's milk, and they're actually concentrating the cow's milk. And it turned out that consumers who drink a lot of milk in Hawaii turned out to be more likely to develop Parkinson's disease. And when they looked, by coincidence, at the brains of those individuals who were high consumers of milk and who had developed Parkinson's disease, they found fewer nerve cells in their brain, in the parts that are known to be damaged by Parkinson's disease, and they found the remnants of the pesticide that had been sprayed on the feed that had been fed to the cows in their brain.
It's a very common disease, and over a lifetime, 1 in 15. So if you're in a classroom of 30 when you're growing up, 2 people that you know, either you or somebody else, or 2 people in that class are going to end up with Parkinson. Even though the risk is going to be higher for people that have exposure to things like pesticides and in farmers and in certain occupations, this is something that should worry all of us.
That's Dorsey's co-author, Dr. Michael Oken, National Medical Director of the Parkinson's Foundation and Executive Director at the Norman Fixell Institute for Neurological Diseases at the University of Florida. Oken says the troubling spread of Parkinson's hasn't made headlines because there hasn't been a strong grassroots effort to raise awareness about the growing problem.
I think that the advocacy that we're seeing is not as organized as we'd like to see it. So we see a lot of families that are affected, that are worried, that are trying to advocate. But one of the things that we highlighted in the Ending Parkinson's Disease book is prevent, advocate, care, and treat. And we use that example of the advocacy of polio with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Eddie Cantor in the White House and mail dimes into the White House. We use the example of the HIV community coming together, occupying the FDA, putting a condom over Jesse Helms' house, and being aggressive and charismatic. And I don't want to in any way say that the Parkinson community, because I've worked with them my whole career, hasn't been active and engaged, but we do need to raise it up an octave or 2 and become more charismatic and create a larger group.
For many people familiar with Parkinson's disease, the actor Michael J. Fox is the reason why. The Michael J. Fox Foundation has funded research and put the spotlight on Parkinson's disease, but Oken says more needs to be done.
If you take HIV as one example, when their funding jumped up to $2 to $3 billion a year, this is through the National Institutes of Health, which is the largest funder of healthcare research in the world. So when you have a level of funding that is going into a disease that's proportional to the problem, you can actually make progress much faster. And so the funding for Parkinson is at about $200 million. And so I often say to people, what if we doubled that from $200 to $400 million? Or what if we actually took that by a factor of more than 10, like they did for HIV, which prevented so many people from getting HIV, for the development of new treatments? We're just not bringing enough young people into research. We're not having enough science. We don't have enough projects focused on both symptomatic and focused on treatment.
We've done this before. In the 1950s, we created a march of dimes that led to the eradication of polio. We prevented polio. We don't have polio treatment centers. We just got rid of polio. In the 1980s, a group of activists rose up when they were discriminated against and have turned HIV into among the most treatable conditions that we have, even more treatable than Parkinson's disease, and have prevented millions of people from ever developing the disease by simply changing our sexual practices. If we can do that for polio and we can do that for HIV and we're doing that for COVID-19, we can certainly do the same thing for Parkinson's disease.
However, there are no cures for Parkinson's disease today, only treatments.
One of the things that we talk about in the COVID-19 era is many people may not realize, but there are monoclonal antibodies and also vaccines that are in trial for Parkinson, and those may or may not be the answer, but this whole area of neuroinflammation and neuroimmunology is super important. We are looking at all sorts of gut-brain interactions, diets, nutritional elements, different brain targets, not only cannabinoids and some of the more controversial targets, at least politically controversial, but other targets in the brain for medicines. And we have all these great neuromodulatory techniques to change the way that different circuits are interacting with each other. And so there are a slate of therapies that are coming along through the laboratory, but we're going to need to put more investment in them to bring out that science, and so the science is going to actually yield therapies for folks.
More proof that we can tackle a disease with enough effort comes from COVID-19. Governments and corporations worldwide have spent billions of dollars on COVID research and have quickly discovered vaccines.
Billions of dollars now that have been pushed into COVID-19 through the National Institutes of Health and through related programs, but we've also seen immediate partners and investments in the private sectors. We've seen multiple countries. We've seen a real galvanizing of forces. And when you look at a disease like Parkinson, it's the same deal, right? This is a worldwide problem, and that's why some people would even attach a word like pandemic. Again, it's not infectious, so we tend not to use that word, but the numbers are actually staggering when we think about the rapid rise.
There is no vaccine for Parkinson's, and Oken says there never will be. The authors gave the book the title Ending Parkinson's Disease because the only cure is to make sure it doesn't develop in the first place.
I mean, there is no reason that we as a society cannot have strawberries that are free of pesticides. If we can develop a vaccine for COVID in 10 months, we can get strawberries that are free of pesticides and help prevent people from ever developing this debilitating disease.
A lot of people miss the diagnosis because they feel like, well, maybe you're just getting old, or maybe you're slow, or maybe you're shuffling with your feet, but there are cardinal symptoms. It usually affects one side more than the other, and there are more than 20 motor and non-motor symptoms. The non-motor symptoms are things like depression and anxiety, and the motor symptoms could be tremor, but 1 in 5 don't have tremor, but there's a certain form of stiffness and bradykinesia, which is slowness, but there can be lots of things, loss of facial expression, problems with your handwriting can be smaller, a decreased arm swing, and many folks will get misdiagnosed and get, unnecessary orthopedic surgeries for arm pain or shoulder pain or other features.
Researching this book shook Dorsey's health habits, particularly when it comes to food preparation.
I purchase a lot more organic fruits and vegetables than I did previously. I wash all my fruits and vegetables with water and a little bit of soap to remove many of the fat-soluble pesticides that are used. So there's no great data on what the impact is for consumers from eating pesticide-laden fruits and vegetables, but if I had Parkinson's disease, I would not be anxious to expose my brain to more nerve toxins.
Dorsey says one good thing that's come out of the COVID response that's helped Parkinson's patients is the rapid expansion of telemedicine.
Many people with Parkinson's disease live in rural and suburban areas far from urban centers, where people like me practice neurology. So we think that telemedicine is a key way to enable anyone, anywhere to receive the care that they need, and that the temporary changes that were enabled in the setting of the public health emergency need to become permanent so that people can continue to receive care regardless of who they are and where they live.
Some experts say we didn't take COVID-19 seriously enough when it first arrived, and then we allowed it to turn into a pandemic. But what about Parkinson's disease? Is the world ignoring another pandemic on the horizon? Oken and Dorsey hope their book is both a wake-up call and a step in the right direction. You can learn more about both of our guests and their book, Ending Parkinson's Disease, available now through our website at radiohealthjournal.org. Our writer-producer this week is Polly Hansen. I'm Reed Pence. Coming up next week on Radio Health Journal.
No one is going to go to a restaurant if they think they're going to die. So it really is important that we get the pandemic under control. Otherwise, it'll basically just be wasted money.
How the pandemic has hurt women in the workplace most.
Then, when it comes to hormones, the word doesn't necessarily mean what you may think.
They looked for a word that meant to arouse other glands in the body.
All that and more on Radio Health Journal.
And that's Radio Health Journal for this week. Radio Health Journal is a production of MediaTrax Communications. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more. And check Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify for a library of past programs. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and information about our guests at radiohealthjournal.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Radio Health Journal.